Good morning, Anthea.
Good morning, Sarah. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm Sarah Posner, and this is the Posner Show. And my guest today is Anthea Butler, who is a professor of religion at the University of Pennsylvania. And we're going to talk today about religion and the George Zimmerman trial, which really that particular angle on it hasn't really been discussed that much. But you had a piece over the weekend at Religion Dispatches, and let me just read the first paragraph. The not guilty verdict in the George Zimmerman case has me thinking a lot about a book I first encountered in seminary, Is God a White Racist? By the Reverend Dr. Bill Jones. As a budding seminary student, it took me by surprise. Now, as a wiser, older professor, looking at the needless death of Trayvon Martin, I have to say, I get it. So, expand on that a little bit. I mean, obviously people can go and read the piece for themselves, but let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, Bill Jones' book, he just passed away last year, and that was a sad passing for a lot of us in the religion and theological world. He was trying to really wrestle with the fact that post-civil rights, that, African Americans were still having a hard time. And that it really seemed as though God, the way that God had been sort of talked about in American Christianity more broadly, really wasn't there for Black people. And with the jury's decision in the Trayvon Martin trial, I really was thinking about that because there was so much lament from African Americans and others on Twitter and Facebook, and people calling each other when the verdict came down late Saturday night. So it occurred to me that that book really spoke to a lot of the historic and current pain of African Americans, that, no matter how much people may pray, they might think that God is on their side sometimes, that God's not on their side. And so what Jones was doing in the book was to take it one step further and says, maybe God's just not for Black people. Maybe this God that we've constructed in America is not the God for Black people at all. It's a punitive God. And what I did in my piece was to sort of tie this to what I call the well-meaning Christians, although you know that I'm really saying something else. To tie it to the well-meaning Christians who believe that, justice was served and this was a fair trial, and that George Zimmerman did nothing wrong by getting out of the car and racially profiling Trayvon Martin. So,
well, they would contest even that.
Yeah, they would contest
formulation of it.
Yeah, they would contest that formulation of it. But I think what that speaks to is a difference in how, African Americans who've had to deal with the 400 plus years of child slavery, a civil rights movement, watching how the first African American president has been denigrated. They see it one way, and we see facts in a very different light because we've had to undergo this kind of racial injustice and persecution in this country. So,
well, I think that, Go ahead.
No, go first.
So I think we heard a lot about Trayvon Martin's parents' religion, or at least their religious views of what happened to their child. Because after the trial, both of them, I think, both Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin, tweeted about their continued faith in God despite what had happened. And on Sunday morning, I think even Saturday night, their lawyers who were on television acting as their spokespeople talked about how they were going to go to church on Sunday morning, the Sunday morning after the verdict. And so I think that the way we heard about religion post-verdict was that religion was giving Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin strength in the face of this horrible thing that had happened to them, the murder of their child, and then also the subsequent acquittal of George Zimmerman. And that's one specific way of looking at the role of religion here. And it's a way of looking at it that's sort of like, well, religion people's faith gives them comfort, and that's a nice thing. And then let's move on to the next topic. Because, it's sort of like, I'm not being completely articulate here, but you know what I mean? Do you know what I'm saying? It's sort of
no,
like,
I know exactly
it's this
what you're
very
saying.
narrow view that, religion gives people comfort, end of story.
Yeah,
But
and
not
that's
always
true.
It's true, but it's not the only part of the story.
Exactly. And that's why I wrote the piece, because I think that for many people, they're, when they hear the story about Trayvon's mother and father, they say, oh, that's great. This is what Black people do all the time. They suffer and endure despite everything. But at the same time, there's a sense of questioning. We call it the Odyssey. It's like, why do bad things happen to good people? Right? And
Right.
I don't doubt that they are people of strong faith, and I don't begrudge that to them one bit. As a matter of fact, I think
Absolutely.
they need it.
Right.
I mean, and I want to put that out there. What I do think, however,
Agreed.
is that people tend to think, especially here in the United States, it's a simplistic version of God. I put it in a succinct statement on Twitter. I said, God is not good all of the time, because there's a statement in the Black church where people say, God is good all the time. And I'm like, no, God's not good all the time. And then people wanted to argue with me, and I'm like, have you read the Old Testament? Smite them all, kill them, and God can be very punitive. And so I think that, in a sense, this idea that, faith is just wonderful, and they'll just, God will console them, it doesn't bring back their son. And also, the other reason why I did the piece was to tie this into Zimmerman's statement to Sean Hannity last year about this was God's will. I mean, like, what? This was God's will that you shoot somebody and you kill them? And that's where, you have to sort of try to reconcile what Zimmerman is saying up against what Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin are saying about their faith. I mean, if all these people are people of faith, then whose God is the real God here? And that's the bigger question.
What does Dr. Jones say in this book, the book that's called Is God a White Racist? What's his thesis there?
Well, his thesis is basically that this God is not for Black people. And this God, because of all the persecution and the suffering and all the kinds of things, this construction of God, yeah, exactly, this construction of God, that, perhaps people need to think twice about what is happening and how God gets deployed in these certain kinds of instances. For instance, how people did during slavery and said, well, there's slavery in the Bible, then that means therefore there's slavery. I mean, this broke up Presbyterians, Methodists, etc. over the issue of slavery. And we just haven't really had a really substantive discussion, because even in the civil rights movement, the ways that Martin Luther King is portrayed as being, this very saintly person of faith, who actually was really complex about his thinking on faith. And to think that, it's all about not the color of skin, but the content of their character. To just, cherry pick the kinds of things that he was really saying, deep theological thinking in, Letter from Birmingham Jail and other pieces. I think it really misses, the sense in which people need to wrestle with God. And they need to wrestle in times like this when something really bad has happened. How do we discuss God? I imagine that it was really a lot of hard sermons for a lot of churches this past Sunday, who had to get up and say, we prayed for a just verdict and this is the verdict we got, but you probably think that this is unjust. And how do we reconcile that up against what we know of, in Christianity at least, about God?
Well, I think what we heard a lot about Sunday morning was that there were a lot of churches that were having wear your hoodie to church Sunday, encouraging people to wear a hoodie to church in solidarity with Trayvon Martin and his family and their loss. But that's all we heard about. I mean, we did not hear the stories of wrestling with this complex God. And I think it's part of this inclination to simplify it for the sake of comfort, but then everybody simplifies it for the sake of their own comfort, and that's what a lot of religion is. But I think by focusing on those things, we miss these sort of more complicated stories of race and religion, and also just the complexity of understanding what this concept of God who does allow these terrible things to happen. Now, I think everybody tried to comfort themselves. The Trayvon's parents had the tweets that emphasized their continued faith in God despite what had happened.
Mm-hmm.
George Zimmerman told Sean Hannity that, he thought that this was God's will, that it all turned out this way. This was all, these are people's use of this to comfort themselves.
Yeah.
But it doesn't address this
Yeah,
bigger issue that you're trying to get at.
Yeah, and I'm trying to get at something bigger, and I'm trying to point people to something bigger. And a lot of people got it, but there were also people who didn't get it, and that's all the sort of the right-wing folks who think I'm the devil because I said, God is a white racist. But the God that they actually sort of buy into is kind of a white racist. I'm sorry. I mean, they like that God. They like the God that has had them win this, they believe win this case. They like the God who, likes to subjugate women. They like this stuff. This is what they believe. And so when you call that out, people get really upset about it. And, I understand it, but that doesn't mean I don't have the right to say it, just like they have the right to believe what they do.
The stand your ground laws, which obviously played such a big role in this whole case, the whole idea behind that, obviously there's been a lot of attention paid to the fact that ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, the conservative group, had lobbied for passage of these laws, not just in Florida, but in other states. I don't remember the number, but in any case, so this idea of defending yourself on your own property, I think for a lot of people does have some sort of biblical or religious connotation. I think that people think of the NRA as being a secular organization and the gun rights movement as just being about the Second Amendment right to own a gun. And in this case, to defend yourself, although there's a lot of questions about whether Zimmerman needed to defend himself or whether, somebody else, perhaps Trayvon Martin, needed to defend himself. But in any case, if you talk to religious backers of gun rights, you will hear them talk about these sorts of issues in a very religious way, in a way where they talk about the Constitution being a God-ordained document, and therefore the Second Amendment being a God-given right to own a gun. That there's a biblical basis for owning a gun and protecting yourself from wrongdoers in society. And in this view, the government should play a very limited role, and people should be able to, quote unquote, defend themselves from wrongdoers in society. Without the intervention of government telling them that they can't do these things. Yeah. And to think that is an idea that's free of religious connotation and free of a religious impetus is really quite mistaken. I mean, I've talked to religious gun rights supporters, and it's very much for them rooted in this idea of how biblical government should work and God-given rights and freedom.
Yeah, no, exactly, and I think the hardened ideology around it is really religiously based. So once we understand that gun rights and standing your ground, castle doctrine, all of that stuff has religious overtures to it, then it becomes really easy to see why people, especially, in southern states and other kinds of states, are invested in this stuff. So, I mean, that's why I say there's much more of a religious piece to this trial than people would talk about. On the other side, I think this is helpful too. One of the things that I thought was really interesting was right before the verdict was read that, police in Sanford tried to pair with the pastors and all of these other kinds of folks in order to portray calm, right? So that, nobody would riot, nobody's doing any stuff. And most of that hasn't happened. And it might have been some isolated incidences. But for the most part, the church is also used to tamp down emotion. And that's what's very interesting to me, is that religion is used in a way to try to diffuse emotion on the left. On the left, it's like, calm down, don't get upset. But on the right. Religion is used to incite emotion. And that's what's so interesting to me in this case, is that how, the people who want to, portray for calm, don't do anything, blah, blah, blah. This should all be, keep your faith, pray, do all this other stuff. On the right, what people have been, sort of saying is like, we're happy that the verdict happened, but there's also been this talk of, well, there's going to be riots, and there's going to be this, and there's going to be that. And even the deployment of religion between left and right is really interesting to see how that's different between these two groups.
I haven't really noticed or paid attention to what right-wing preachers have been saying about, or conservative preachers have been saying about the trial. Has there been anybody of note or notoriety talking about it?
Not really. I think most of them have tried to stay, the usual suspects, I call it the Pat Robertsons and everybody else, have tried to remain silent. Somebody like Family Research Council guy, I haven't seen him come out with anything, although he probably did. I think the sense that I'm getting from, and this is just a sense from Twitter and some of these other places, is that they've seen this primarily as a justice issue. But I think it's important to point out one thing that you said is really important. For most of these people on the right, the Bible is the text, but the Constitution also goes along with the Bible. Mm-hmm. And so it's almost in itself a religious text, because they see that, for a lot of them, they see the Constitution as being derived from God. So all these, stand your ground, castle doctrine, right to bear arms, Second Amendment, all this stuff is deeply embedded for them in a religious world. And once you understand that, then you're on to the key of understanding why these things are so, they want to hold on to them so well, and why, things like ALEC and all this, they know how to play into that, and they know how to hit those heartstrings just right of the people who really want these laws. The other thing I was going to say, and this is, it's probably not the most politic thing to say, because you never know who's by you at the firing range, is that I think people would be very surprised, and this has come up a lot, because one of the things that the president says, we should use this against gun violence. But I think that a lot of people are not surprised that, on an average day in some place like Texas, where I have been to the firing range, that it's not just adults there, it's children. Mm-hmm. Okay, and there's children of 8, 9, and 10 learning how to shoot. Mm-hmm. And so this is something that has been, I'm not saying that people can't do this. People hunt, I have relatives who hunt, all this stuff. And I think it is right. You need to learn how to use a firearm properly if you're going to use one. What I do think, though, is interesting to me is that we have, generational transfer of all of these things. And so the stand your ground laws, castle doctrine, everything else, these kids are growing up knowing this stuff. I mean, they know it, and they want to protect themselves, and their parents are taking them to the range to learn how to shoot. So it's not just about hunting, it's about protection, but all of this runs off of fear. And that is the core of of what happened with Trayvon Martin. There's the fear of a black man walking around a hoodie.
Right. Let's use that point to segue to the interview last night that Anderson Cooper did with the juror who's identified as only B37. Mm-hmm. And she, she doesn't want her name known, and she was, her identity was obscured on television. And initially, it was reported yesterday that she had signed with a literary agent, was going to write a book about the trial. And then afterwards said, oh, gosh, I didn't realize that this had incited such intense emotions on both sides of the issue. And so I think maybe I'm not going to write a book about it. But Dahlia Lithwick had an interesting piece on Slate, kind of looking at it from the lawyer's angle, as in, how did this woman not get stricken from the jury?
Yeah.
And that was a really interesting piece that talked a little bit about how she didn't really read the newspaper. She used the newspaper to line the cage for her parrot, and that her main source of news, or her only source of news, was the Today Show. So in the interview with Anderson Cooper, she talks about how she hadn't really followed the case at all, which may have been one of the reasons why she didn't get struck from the jury pool, because she didn't come to the trial with preconceived notions from having read a lot of news coverage of it. But it was interesting because one of the parts of it that sort of drew my attention more closely, I guess, was when Cooper was asking her about the different witnesses and which ones she found credible and which ones she found not so credible. And I was very interested dismayed during the discussion of her perception of Rachel Gentile, who was Trayvon Martin's friend, who was the last person to speak to him by phone when he was first noticed Zimmerman following him. Mm-hmm. And Juror B37 tells Anderson Cooper last night, he said, what did you make of her testimony? And the juror said, I didn't think it was very credible, but I felt very sorry for her. She didn't ask to be in this place. She didn't ask. She wanted to go. She wanted to leave. She didn't want to be any part of this jury. I think she means trial. I think she felt inadequate toward everyone because of her education and her communication skills. I just felt sadness for her. And then she goes on to say that Gentile was embarrassed by being there because of her education and her communication skills. She just wasn't a good witness. And that she found a lot of the times it was hard to understand what she was saying. She was using phrases I have never heard before, didn't know what they meant. That was, I thought, a kind of, I thought that was a really telling revelation of what was going through the juror, at least one juror's head, with regard to Rachel Gentile, and also combine that with the fact that this juror said she did not think that George Zimmerman racially profiled Trayvon, and she could sort of understand how he might have found him suspicious, and his heart was in the right place, and he really just felt like he wanted to help people and help the people in his neighborhood who had been burglarized and vandalized and that sort of thing. And I thought that was all just very telling about how this juror was perceiving from a racial perspective what was going on here.
Yeah, and she
George
couldn't even hear
Zimmerman's
herself.
heart was in the right place.
Yeah, she couldn't even hear herself. She couldn't hear it. I mean, that's what's so killing to me. It's like she was a textbook case in implicit racial bias. Rachel Gentile didn't understand it, but George is so nice. He's worried about the neighborhood. I mean, it was just amazingly stunning to hear how much of that, was racialized. And in this piece I wrote for the Griot, I said that the Zimmerman trial was all about race. And it was. From the very beginning, when the judge said, you can't use race in the trial. But race was everywhere, right? And now we hear from Juror B37 that, one, maybe her parent knows a lot more than she does about the world. Because at least the parent is getting the newspaper. And I just thought this was ridiculous. And then the second piece was, that there were these biases, of course, that jurors have when they come in. And the prosecution didn't do a good enough job of trying to assuage that. And they let the defense set up and use that racial bias to win their case. And I think
So to me, her whole discussion, I watched the discussion with Anderson Cooper about Rachel Gentile and then read the transcript again a couple of times. And it was like with Juror B37, she felt that, she didn't really understand. She felt that Gentile was not educated, that she was speaking a sort of language that the juror, didn't really understand, so therefore her testimony wasn't credible. I mean, that was the word that was being used in the interview, was her testimony credible? Yeah. And it was, well, she used a language and a way of talking that wasn't familiar to me. And so therefore what she had to say about what happened that night and about Trayvon wasn't credible to me. And that to me just sort of encapsulated so much about what was going on in this trial beyond the who struck John aspect of it. No, absolutely. I mean, that was in a nutshell. Basically, she didn't believe Rachel Gentile. She's not going to believe Trayvon.
She's not going to believe the things that the prosecution is saying about Trayvon, because both of those things are embedded in what she thinks about, blackness, what she thinks about a black person. And if she hears, it could have been somebody white from, Appalachia or something saying, speaking in a way that she didn't understand. But I will tell you implicitly that she would have identified with that person better than she would have identified with Rachel Gentile, because that person looked like her.
At the end of the interview, she breaks down and cries and talks about how terrible it was, that somebody died here. And, so it was clear that she grappled with, it wasn't like she just dismissed the gravity of what had happened. She didn't. She understood the gravity of what had happened, but I thought that interview just showed what she brought to the jury room with her, as she evaluated the evidence.
Yeah, absolutely. And she is who she is. That's not going to change. I mean, I hope she doesn't get a book deal, quite frankly, because, if she's this simplistic about her thinking, then I don't know what would be in
under
the book.
no circumstances do I think people should profit from these sorts of things.
Yeah, I don't either. So, and, she may have grappled with it, but she also has something else to grapple with, and that's her own biases. And I don't know that she ever will. She sounds like somebody who comes from a protected community, if I understand correctly. Her husband is an attorney as well. I don't know how she didn't get kicked out of the jury pool, to be quite honest. I think that's a fascinating observation. And the whole reason why she decided to go on these shows tells me a lot. When she said that her news came from the Today Show and everything else, clearly there's also a sense for her in which, I'd like to go on the TV shows because I can actually be the news for a change. The news the way she understands the news.
Well, it's interesting also, she referred to everyone in the case by their first name. She continually referred to Zimmerman as George. And she also referred to Martin as Trayvon. Mm. But it was interesting. It was like she had... it was like the experience had given her what she believed to be a level of familiarity with the people involved.
Yeah.
It was interesting. Let's move on from jurors to pundits.
Yes.
Today in the Washington Post, Richard Cohen has an opinion piece that, again, kind of blows me away. He writes, "I don't like what George Zimmerman did, and I hate that Trayvon Martin is dead, but I also can understand why Zimmerman was suspicious and why he thought Martin was wearing a uniform we all recognize." I was just blown away that the Washington Post published that.
Yeah, a uniform we all recognize. What?
Mm-hmm.
A hoodie.
What is that?
I was like, you mean, is that the universal symbol for I must be a thug? Then,
criminal?
I know that there's a whole bunch of little black, white kids who are going to be thugs too. It's just ludicrous to me, but it also speaks to, and I think this is the most important thing, actually. Rich Cohen ought to be ashamed of himself, and the Washington Post ought to just, I'm like, come on, people, aren't you better than this? You want me to pay to read this kind of stuff? I'm not paying for it, okay? But
in the Washington Post's defense, they also have a Eugene Robinson piece today.
Yeah,
which doesn't counteract.
No, it doesn't counteract the stuff. Cohen, it just doesn't counteract the bad.
Right.
But I think, it's another mirror into this world in which, I keep thinking somebody had a poster up in one of the protests in New York about, Invisible Man, the book by Richard Wright. And I just think for a whole bunch of white people in this country, black people are invisible to them. African Americans are invisible to them, and the only way that they're visible to them are through stereotypes. And I'm going to bring her into this. We're not talking about her today, but Paul Dean and Richard Cohen are just right there on the same level, because they have this idea about what a proper black person should be versus, this guy must have been bad because he had a hoodie on. And all of that stuff, that kind of bias that people are operating with is really quite stunning to me. In 2013, that we have a nation that is still so gripped by stereotypical racial ideology. And we have allowed people to have pundit jobs and, all this stuff I mean, this is a cottage industry to just continue to fuel the kinds of, thinking that doesn't really help. And I'm always struck by the fact that I get a lot of criticism for the things I say, and I'm like going, I don't really understand how, somebody like a Richard Cohen could write something like this and think that that was okay and not second guess himself. And I don't know how, his editorial person let that get through. But I think it's a telling moment, and maybe it's good that he said it. Now we know what he thinks. Now we know that he's really not that much different than George Zimmerman was, except he didn't have a gun in his hand and get out of the car. He might have just run the other direction or something. But yeah.
While we're talking about racial stereotypes, the other thing that struck me about the way the trial played out was that Trayvon Martin was not depicted as a young person. He was depicted as I felt like the defense used this racist trope that he was, so strong, and poor George Zimmerman could not, resist or, needed his gun because Martin was of such superhuman strength that he was beating his head into the sidewalk and he was on the bottom and Zimmerman was on the bottom and couldn't break away. I think it embedded this idea that Trayvon Martin was not a kid coming home from the convenience store with a bag of candy in his hand, but that he was this, super strength, dangerous, threatening person.
Yeah, no,
adult.
Exactly. And it's in the sense of, I do mostly 19th and 20th century American religious history. And in the 19th century, black men in the post-Reconstruction period were depicted as, brutal beasts. They were rapists. They wanted to get after white women all the time, all this kind of stuff. And this went into the 20th century when you have lynchings and all this stuff and people falsely accused and killed. So this whole trajectory of how black men especially are seen fell into this trial, and they had, a couple hundred years of stereotypes to play on that are very much embedded and ingrained. And when you have, a sort of the repetition of all these things all the time in the trial, and especially the moment in the trial where they had the woman come who lived in the subdivision and said that, she'd been robbed by two African-American men, that raised the specter of what Trayvon Martin was to them even higher. And what the saddest part of this trial is that Trayvon Martin was on trial. It was not George Zimmerman, really. It was Trayvon Martin who was on trial for being, a black boy not in the wrong place who didn't answer to the guy who asked him what he was doing. I mean, the whole scene between, the way that it gets described between Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman is almost like out of a scene of the 19th century where a slave is being asked for his pass. And that's what's so troubling and frightening about all of this. And, quite frankly, Florida is not a place that I would want to ever live or be. But this kind of thinking is not just limited to Florida. Obviously, if Richard Cohen is saying this in Washington, D.C., then this is something the whole country has to deal with. And that's what I think the really sad part is about this, is that we need another kind of national conversation on race, but we need a real conversation about it. We don't need to ignore it.
Well, do you think a lot of people are saying that this event is a useful trigger for that conversation? But do you think it is?
I don't know. I don't know that it's going to be a trigger for a sustained conversation. What I do know is that we've probably needed to have this conversation since the election of an African-American president in 2008, Barack Obama.
Uh-huh.
I mean, because it's the kinds of racial stuff that was always there became full bore when he became president, and then with subsequent re-election. I mean, this is not all of America, but clearly these ideas have been allowed to settle in and to harden. And what I fear the most is that while people are who are upset with me call me a race baiter, and that why am I talking about race, that's over. The fact of the matter is that we have to talk about this because the only way out is through. And if we don't talk about it, it's not going to happen. And race baiting isn't talking about race. Race baiting is trying to believe that race doesn't exist and that everybody is the same and equal. If that were the case, then that trial would have turned out very differently. And what Mark O'Mara said about if George Zimmerman had been black, he'd have gone off. That was just when I thought the most brilliant moment on Twitter on Saturday night was when Michael Steele said, "Is he on drugs?" I mean, if even the former, Michael Steele,
the former chair of the
Republican National Committee, when even Michael Steele, who was the head of the RNC, an African American man, knew that Mark O'Mara was absolutely insane to say if George Zimmerman was black, he would get off. That's telling you everything you need to know. Everything. Yeah. Even he can't buy that kind of, line.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that, it'll be, when you think back to other events that people thought might be a good trigger for a national conversation on race, a lot of them were pre-Twitter.
Yeah, exactly.
It's interesting to see this stuff. I mean, just from if you draw back from it for a little bit and sort of play sociologist or anthropologist and see how it plays out on Twitter as opposed to other media or other forms of having conversation about these things.
Yeah.
It's pretty interesting. In a lot of ways, I think Twitter opens up the conversation in interesting and useful ways. But then you have to remember that we're part of a tiny fraction of the population that actually lives on Twitter.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And I think the other it's absolutely true. I mean, the other part of the country, where would they get this conversation? They might get it at church, but it's doubtful.
I mean, I think a lot of people are on Twitter and they might not be tweeting, but they're following people on Twitter and following the conversation. But I still think that it's a pretty small segment of the population that pays.
Well, yeah, that's true. I'm not on Facebook pages a lot, so I think a lot of this is going on Facebook. But then again, that's a closed system too. You only are following the people you want. You're not having, most of the people who follow each other on Twitter are like-minded, right? So the right's Twitter is
or Facebook follow people that they disagree with just for the
just for the fun of it, right?
But the education, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to say it, but I kind of think it's someplace like maybe The View, or somewhere else that we end up having conversations like this. It's not going to be substantive conversations. I mean, the president studiously in his statement avoided the word race, which I was not really happy with, because it was a moment that he could have said it, and I was criticized for it by blacks and whites alike. It was just dumb to me.
I have two minds of that. One mind is he should have called it for what it is, and then my other mind of it is you know what? Maybe it's better that he doesn't.
Yeah.
Because then he can sort of just be the president without having to.
Yeah.
It just comes with so much baggage.
It comes with a lot of baggage. But he is who he is.
And on the one hand, you want him to be a leader on those things, but then on the other hand, you want the president, whoever the president is, the president of the United States, to be able to be the president of the United States and, get immigration reform and climate change legislation and, judicial nominations to the Senate,
but none of that is happening now because we have gridlock, because everybody just tests each other.
I know.
None of it is happening. So what, I'm of the mind that what does it really matter, because nothing is getting done anyway right now.
Yeah.
Nothing. And so you have nothing to lose. Some people told me he couldn't say anything because of the DOJ case, the Justice Department case. I don't know if I buy that.
Too. I do buy that, actually.
Yeah,
I could see how they don't want I think it's going to be hard for the Justice Department a case, which I doubt that they will.
Yeah, I
just think that they don't want to have it for it to seem like been politicized.
I just think Eric Holder's already been compromised enough that it will be it'll be problematic for the Justice Department to pick this up. But that's a whole other story. But there we go.
Well, you know, we tried to start a conversation on Blogging Heads.
Yeah. Well, we're not going to solve it, but at least we had a conversation, right?
Right.
Right.
All right. Well, thanks so much for doing it.
Hey, thank you. Take care, Sarah.
Okay.